and I am going to start the webinar. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our program. Before we get started, just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of our upcoming three-part series in January. As you can see on your screen, we hope you will sign up for this three-part series with Greg Zipes. And again, we are very grateful to the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowments for the Arts for sponsoring this program this evening. Tonight we have with us Annelise Heinz, who is a professor at the University of Oregon and has written a book called Mahjong, a Chinese game and the making of modern American culture. And she will be discussing with us all of the ins and outs of a game that we all know and how its impact has had both on Jewish culture and culture at large. Please, again, make sure that you hold all of your questions for the chat. And if you can submit them via the chat feature on the bottom of your screen, I am happy to moderate a question and answer session at the end of this evening's presentation. And without further ado, let me hand it over to Annelise Heinz.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here today. I'm really looking forward to sharing the history of the game that so many of us on this call know and love. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can share images as well. So what you're seeing here is a picture of my book. And there's a big question that I explore in the book and that brought us here today. And that is, how did this Chinese game, Mahjong, shape the making of modern American culture? And before I dive in, I just want to quickly define the game. I suspect that the vast majority of folks here play it, know it, love it, but I never like to assume that knowledge. So if you don't know Mahjong, don't worry. You've got everything you need to understand and enjoy today as well. So Mahjong is a game played with tiles instead of cards. And these are 1920s tiles that you can see here. We'll talk about those again soon. But these are made out of bone and bamboo. And you can see the designs on them are carved because the tiles are composed of suits that players use in different combinations to make winning hands. Again, in the traditional Chinese game, this is somewhat similar to the card game of Gin Rummy. Today, there are more than 40 variations of Mahjong around the world, and it's played differently depending on its context. So we'll come back to that story of how the American versions of Mahjong came to be and how they evolved. But the question I'm asked most frequently when I talk about my research is, how did I come to this history in this game? Well, I first learned Mahjong when I lived in China for a year before I began my PhD program at Stanford. And this is a picture I took of the first game I ever played. I was taught by a friend whose grandfather from Shanghai had taught her. And it was just the very basic version of the Chinese game. But as many of the players on the call will know, I immediately fell in love with the way the tiles looked, the way they felt in my hand, right? They're cool and smooth and heavy, and each set tells its own story. While I lived in China, I saw Mahjong everywhere as part of the fabric of everyday life. And this is a photo I took of 4 shop workers on break playing a game in the alley. And this is actually a group of 3 women and a man. He's the one who's sensibly wearing a sun hat. And although American Mahjong is most strongly associated with women, in China, Mahjong is both a men's and women's game, and it can be played separately in gender-segregated groups or together. young and old play it, again, separately or together. So before we dive in, I want to start with the origins of the game, how it began in China. And really how this game evolved in my own research has really been a kind of search for a needle in a haystack. It's really been a treasure hunt. And this is a collage of images I took in my research, including an image of a woman named Hilda Schaeffer, who was one of dozens of people I interviewed who so generously shared their memories and stories with me. We'll come back to Hilda later as well. So back to the origins of the game. As best we know, the game originated in the area around Shanghai in the Yangtze River Delta in the mid to late 1800s. So although it becomes known as a, quote, game of Confucius or an ancient game, it's actually, again, just from the quite recent, from the mid to late 1800s. And it becomes an important part of courtesan culture. And you can see a picture of a courtesan hall in this image from the 1890s. It begins as one of many, mostly male, gambling games that was not widely known out of a few major urban centers. So it spreads from Shanghai to Beijing by the early 20th century, but is not, again, known as a particularly special or notable game, and much of China does not yet encounter this game until later in the 20th century. And what happens in the 1920s changes the game's trajectory around the world, in China as well as in the United States and Europe and beyond. So this is a quick timeline showing a couple of the main points here. One, when the game originated and stabilized in the form that we know today in the late 1800s. And when it came to the United States in 1922, when it was actually marketed, it wasn't brought over by immigrants, it was actually intentionally marketed to an American public as a new and exciting consumer good. And the most influential person who brought the game over and marketed it to a broader American public was a Standard Oil representative named Joseph Park Babcock. In this period of 1922, 1923, 1924, the game exploded across the American scene. It took off like wildfire. This is an advertisement from a department store in Sacramento, California, that was really typical of the kind of advertising around the game at the time. You can see at the top how the game's name was advertised as coined by Joseph Park Babcock as Mahjong with two words with a hyphen in the middle and the double G. The double G was explicitly, he added the double G to create and accentuate this aura of foreignness, of mystery, of exoticism that was an essential part of how the game was marketed. You'll note that in my book, I use Mahjong as one word, and that's really because I'm talking about Mahjong as a game across different traditions, but there are multiple acceptable ways to spell it. And this is the version that's most widely known in American versions of the game because of this origin story in the 1920s. So you can see in the image here, there's a picture of 4 white women, some of whom are dressed in ornate robes or have their hair in kind of Chinese buns. And around them are these really intricate designs, again, intentionally evoking an aura of mystery and excitement and exoticism. You can see Chinese lanterns, smoke, some representations of Chinese dragons, and up in front you can see what a 1920s set looked like in this wooden cabinet with drawers that were pulled out and those bone and bamboo tiles inside. So the game spreads across the nation. President and First Lady Harding are playing it, Hollywood celebrities are playing it, and everyone in between is at least talking about, if not also learning and buying the game. It surpasses these marketers' wildest expectations. And so in this time period, in 1923, Western and Chinese businessmen create new kinds of factories that combined this kind of handcrafted aesthetic on the tiles with standardized large-scale production. And here you can see two craftsmen in a Shanghai factory creating these tiles, and what they're doing is taking cow bones from that basket that you can see near them and cutting them into the part of the face of the tile that will be carved to splice it onto a bamboo back. And the caption says the first process of Mahjong, cutting shin bones from USA. So what we see here is evidence of how huge this fad and manufacturing system was. There was so much demand for these Mahjong sets that the factories ran out of the Chinese supply of cow bones. And so they imported huge numbers of cow bones from Chicago stockyards, shipped out of Galveston, Texas. And so steamships carrying these raw materials of cow bones would have crossed paths with steamships then exporting the finished products of Mahjong sets back to the United States. The American market drove an enormous global fad of Mahjong, and it really changed the meaning and raised the profile of the game in China as well. No longer simply one of many mostly male gambling games, it was, by the end of the decade, known as the national game of China in the country and around the world. And repeatedly, over and over again, part of what drove this interest was that the game was represented as an authentic game of China. And yet, ironically, much of what actually was used to demonstrate that authenticity was based on very stereotypical understandings of China and Chinese culture. The reality was most Americans didn't know much about China at all. And so what you see in this on this cover of this magazine is, again, very typical of images representing what were kind of most widely known images of Chinese culture, dragons, as well as specific costumes. So these weren't just in drawings like this, but also in real life. Society matrons, like this woman in Los Angeles, would dress up in what they imagined to be ancient royal Chinese costume, often based on images from Chinese opera. And in this process, as part of this history, this game, which begins as a mostly male game in China, is imported by male importers like Joseph Park Babcock, is written about by mostly male game experts, becomes feminized and most strongly associated in the American context with women, and specifically and especially with white women, who very often dressed up in Chinese costume. There was a whole performative culture around it, not just at these society matrons' luncheons, but also ballets. This is actually a Vanderbilt daughter starring in a Mahjong-themed ballet. And middle-class housewives could read articles like this one in the Atlanta Constitution, which was the newspaper in Atlanta, Georgia, talking about how to host a Chinese party, which was, quote, all the rage. And again, you can see this real kind of combination of what white Americans would have associated with Chinese culture. At the same time, the game took off as part and parcel of a new developments in advertising and mass consumerism. So department stores were a really key part of popularizing this game. This department store, which is Bullock's in Los Angeles, is showing their Mahjong section. And what you can see here is, again, what they've tried to create as a kind of immersive experience for their presumed white shopper, middle class or wealthy, who could come in and purchase any one of those Mahjong sets in the glass case that you can see in the front of the image, but would also be greeted again by a white salesgirl in Chinese costume, and could see around her these kinds of images of blossoms, Chinese lanterns, as well as a whole mishmash of representations of East Asian culture, South Asian culture, and even the Middle East, which was typical at the time for most Americans and Europeans' understanding of, quote, the East, kind of swirled them all together. Part of the popularity of Mahjong at the time was, again, predicated on this idea of essential foreignness or difference. So one of the most predominant ideas about Asian people was that they were fundamentally different from Westerners. And at this time, as this game is taking off explicitly as a Chinese game, there's a deep kind of paradox and irony, because the 1920s were also a deeply xenophobic and racist era. It was a time of the mainstream popularity of the Ku Klux Klan. So how do we understand this apparent paradox? Well, one key piece of it was around the marketing of Mahjong as an ancient game. So here, this image from a newspaper article is very typical of a representation of an ancient mandarin, meaning a government official, that combined kind of features of Fu Manchu, who was a stereotypical and popular villain in the early 20th century with the long fingernails and the mustache. And the game was, marketers explicitly talked about the game as something that originated in the ancient royal Chinese court and explicitly divorced it from contemporary Chinese immigrants and Chinese people. And so there was a way to then reconcile a rejection of Chinese immigrants while embracing another stereotype of Chinese culture. This one was a, quote, positive stereotype. Although Americans rejected contemporary Chinese culture and assumed that it was backwards, passive, needed to be modernized, they embraced an earlier vision of China as this ancient paragon of civilization. So because of those contradictory and complex stereotypes of Chinese culture, the marketers were able to create a sense of excitement that simultaneously embraced a Chinese game while rejecting Chinese people. At the same time, Chinese Americans navigated this broader fad as well. And here are two Chinese American instructors teaching, again, a group of white women how to play the game in Los Angeles. And you can see that one of them is wearing a Western suit and one of them is wearing a kind of image of a traditional button cap and robe. And they used ideas of Chinese authenticity to create economic opportunities in what was otherwise a highly discriminatory economic environment. At this time, Chinese Americans could not get jobs that were reflective of college degrees that they may have earned from American universities, but they instead were just relegated to the same dead-end, low-wage work of restaurant work and curio shops. And here, in this moment, during the Mahjong fad, they could advertise themselves as authentic representations of the game and as instructors, even if they had also just learned the game alongside the broader American public as part of this global fad. So it was a brief but real economic opportunity, but with a kind of complex and often painful navigation of stereotypes of Chinese people. It was also an opportunity to assert a kind of cultural authority that we can see here from this college student, a USC college student named Eleanor Chan, who speaks out against some of these marketers' rhetoric and is taken seriously. So part of what happens during this boom years of the fad is that there are different importers and different marketers who are warring with each other to try to get more customers to come to them and instead of their competitors. And one of the things that happens is that for a brief moment, Babcock actually says, you know what? This isn't a Chinese game at all. I made the whole thing up. Therefore, you have to buy my version of the game because that's really the only authentic form of Mahjong. And Eleanor Chan and other Chinese Americans spoke out against this and said, no, this is connected to Chinese culture. We understand that this fad and the positive representations of Chinese culture are an opportunity to also hopefully build in a positive impression of China in American culture. So it matters that this is a Chinese game. And in a context in which most of the time newspapers wouldn't even necessarily refer to Chinese Americans by their actual names if they were even represented at all, here she is photographed, named, taken seriously in a mainstream paper. And that was unusual for the time. So it tells us a little bit about that, again, opening of an opportunity to assert cultural authority. Chinese Americans were not only interacting with the game vis-a-vis a white American audience, though. Instead, Mahjong was part of the experience of inclusion and exclusion that really defined much of the Asian American experience in the early 20th century. So within Chinese American communities and Chinatowns, Mahjong served as an unusual tool to bridge generational divides and class divides that also separated Chinese Americans from each other to actually become part of a shared cultural experience, and one that connected to a sense of Chinese heritage as well. Here in 1942, this is a general store photographed in Manhattan's Chinatown. And although you can't see a Mahjong set in this photograph, one was very likely present, either tucked below that counter or in the back room that you can see just a little bit of in this image. And general stores were one of those places where so many different crossing streams of Chinese American society met and interacted in these general stores. And very often, especially in the evening, but also during the day, a game of Mahjong would be happening in a back room as well. So we've now kind of reached through the beginning years of this fad. And I want us to think about how the game now evolves in particularly American-specific ways, which happens after these initial years of the 1920s. So Chinese Americans are one of the people one of the groups who continue to play Mahjong after the fad dies out by the end of the 1920s. Other groups of Americans also continue playing the game, and they pull it in different directions. This is an advertisement from the late 1930s, and it's connected to one of the key parts of the answer of how Mahjong becomes a part of Jewish American culture. So in 1937, the National Mahjong League is formed in New York City by a group of mostly Jewish women. And when we think about how and why Mahjong becomes such an important part of Jewish women's culture, there's not just one part of that answer, but there are several key and core strands. So the first part of that answer is rooted in those fad years of the 1920s when everyone was playing it. The next key part of this answer is with the founding of the League in the late 1930s. Now, the League, which is the board members shown here in their early years, wanted to standardize the game to try to bring it back into popularity. And they thought that, part of why Mahjong died out as a national fad was because, partly because of all those marketing wars, there were so many different little variations of the game and different table rules that it was hard for people to agree upon one exactly same shared version of the game. So they wanted to standardize it. And building on Dorothy Meyerson's work, they wanted to what they call streamline it. So they reduced the number of winning hands and different types of combinations to make one shared version of what becomes called the rule card. Now, in this story, it's important to note that the League imagined that they were going to help bring back these kind of fad years of the game, that they were going to help spread their version of the game across all sectors of American society. And that's not really what happens. What happens is that because of the League's networks as Jewish women connected to Jewish philanthropic organizations and connected to Jewish communities and neighborhoods. It spreads along Jewish women's networks and becomes, particularly after World War II, a really deep-rooted and widespread part of especially middle-class Jewish American women's culture. So we'll get to explaining that in just a moment. But I want us to pause here and recognize Dorothy Meyerson's contributions to this story. So she was a really entrepreneurial person, and she was an important part of both creating that initial version of the game that the League continued to develop, but also in spreading it and popularizing it. So here she is on a television network in the 1950s. She appeared repeatedly on television and on radio, teaching people her version of the game, which was also the League's version of the game. And as the League continues to make changes, they increasingly move the game away from that original 1920s versions over a period of years. So by the early 1960s, which is when the League's board is photographed here, they've changed the number of tiles. They've added joker tiles, which don't exist in other forms. And they've created an annual set of rules that change every year. And that is a totally unique marker of the League's game. But one of the things that happens as they are physically changing the set is that they also are connecting it to manufacturing, so that the games are increasingly manufactured in the United States with carrying cases that look like this. And you can see here a rule card, again, from the early 1960s, one that would have only recently incorporated joker tiles as an element of luck as part of the game. In their early experimentation, they actually were experimenting with flower tiles as a kind of wild card, as they were in the 1920s. And at one point, there were over 20 flowers, and they decided that was just too much luck and it was too not enough skill then. And so they reduced the number of wild cards and made, in part because of the contributions of canasta players, they made them joker tiles as opposed to flower tiles, and they used flower tiles in their own way and not as joker tiles anymore. So one of the key ways that the game increasingly spreads along Jewish women's networks in its early years and on to today is its connection with philanthropy. So because the League was creating these annual rule cards and selling them every year, they quickly, what was connected first to a kind of standardization idea, also became a business idea. Now, the League at the time was run by volunteers. These were wealthy women who not only did not need to work to support their families, actually could not have worked for pay without losing social status for themselves and their families. So they volunteered their time and therefore had this, once their costs were covered, selling these cards then created a profit. And they channeled those monies toward philanthropic causes that were chosen by their members. And so this increases a sense of investment for women who are connected to sisterhoods, hadassahs, PTAs, other neighborhood and patriotic organizations. And particularly during World War II, this then gets connected to patriotic fundraising. And it's part of what is connected to social rhythms that helps the game spread. Now, it's worth pointing out that during the war years, another American version of the game also took root. This is a version of the game that I won't talk about at length here, but I'm happy to talk more about in Q&A. It's connected to Air Force officers' wives, and they create what's called Wright Patterson or Wright Pat Mahjong. It's still played on Air Force bases around the world today. But you can see that they create specific hands that have names that also change over time, but not as regularly or as frequently as the leagues, and not in the form of a card. But here you can see they've named those winning hands thematic names that connect to also military culture, like Pearl Harbor and independence. And part of how this American version of the game was able to spread was because they were supplied with sets by Dorothy Meyerson. So one of Dorothy Meyerson's own businesses that she continued was selling Mahjong sets that she purchased wholesale from New York manufacturers. And so as part of this transition to a localized New York-based manufacturing system of Mahjong tiles, no longer were the tiles those bone and bamboo tiles created by the Shanghai craftsmen. Instead, these were plastic tiles, and they were made out of a form of plastic called Catalan, which is notable because it could hold that kind of fabulous swirled color that you can see on the racks there. This was a new possibility. Although collectors often call all this vintage plastic Bakelite, it's actually not Bakelite, because Bakelite could only come in black and brown. This is another kind of plastic called Catalan that could hold color. And here you can see an advertisement by one of these New York-based manufacturers in Brooklyn, one of the most prolific Mahjong manufacturers at the time, A&L Manufacturing, and they made all the Royal brand sets and related sub-brands. One of the things that you'll notice here in this advertisement is that it says Ivory Catalan, or two-tone, meaning this is still connected to the idea, rooted in the 1920s, that this is a game of ivory and bamboo. We know that, in fact, almost all those sets were made out of bone and bamboo, not ivory. There were very, very few ivory sets made. Elephants were already extremely reduced in number because of the ivory trade. So those were extremely expensive. And really, we're only talking about the Vanderbilts and some royalty around the world. Mostly, they were made out of bone and bamboo. In the 1950s and 60s, in the Catalan sets, even though the tiles today have that kind of butterscotchy yellow, that's because of the way the plastic has aged. At the time, they were actually made to look white or ivory colored. And that was, again, continuing this long tradition and association with ivory as part of the game. Almost never was, though. So all of this helps explain what was happening behind the scenes to create this version of the game. And we understand that part of the social rhythms that helped the game spread was connected to Jewish women's philanthropic networks. But it's also related to key changes in Jewish women's lives after World War II, and particularly connected to the broader story of middle-class Jewish life in the post-war era. One key strand of that were new kinds of leisure communities that were taking off and developing in this period. Most influentially, this took place in the Catskill Mountains, but the similar rhythms were replicated all over the country, including in mountains and all along the East Coast, and also around Lake Michigan, bungalow colonies and resort communities around Lake Michigan with the similar kinds of tempo. So, as some of you may already know, bungalow colonies were places that families could go to during the summer away from a kind of sweltering heat of the summers, often again at lakes or up in the mountains. And what would, in the most typical rhythm, mothers would stay with children all week while fathers would go back and forth on the weekends. And during the week then, women created specific kinds of tempos of leisure in the midst of family life. Although their domestic work continued, their obligations were lowered, and children went to day camps or were off having fun. They were out of sight. They didn't have to prepare meals as extensively or as regularly. And I interviewed someone who talked about how she remembered women playing Mahjong literally, quote, all the time, really all the time. And then she added, except when the men were there. When their men were there, they were there for their men. And that was a really notable difference with how Mahjong grows and spreads and comes to actually function as part of home life. So one of the things that happens as part of Mahjong in the Catskills and in other kinds of vacationing communities, and especially in bungalow colonies, is that it becomes a kind of way to bring a little piece of that leisure and female community into their increasingly suburban lives. So the core of Mahjong culture in the 1950s and 60s was driven by mothers of young children who were sharing a life experience and life stage. People like Charlotte Levy, who was second from the left in this image, and her neighbors in this Philadelphia row house. And Charlotte Levy's family was very typical in that they had moved from the core of the city to slightly outside in a townhome, and then again into an increasingly suburban neighborhood. They moved to a neighborhood that she called, it's the one like the shul with the pool, right? This is part of a longer pattern of kind of stair-step migrations. And as part of this rhythm, Mahjong was played at night when not during the day when kids were at school, right? Kids were home and either their husbands or another relative would help those kids get to bed, would kind of keep an eye on things, so that in a very rare moment in 1950s culture, wives and mothers carved out a space in their homes where other family members were often explicitly kicked out of and not welcome. This was a female-oriented space, and unlike other groups like PTA groups or volunteer groups, this wasn't about work or volunteerism. It was really about having fun and connecting with other women. That was extremely unusual. Again, particularly out of this context of a kind of volunteer context. So in this story, this is a strongly, but not only middle-class story, and it's part of what Jewish Americans experienced at large in this post-war period. Anti-Semitic restrictions lowered after World War II, did not disappear, but substantially lowered. And with the help of the GI Bill, with increased access to things like housing, Jewish Americans experienced, like Italian Americans, a kind of new entry into what was called white ethnics. And as part of the growing category of white Americans in this time, notably, housing restrictions still applied to African Americans and in some places also to Latino and Asian Americans as well. But Italian Catholics and Jewish Americans increasingly shared these suburban neighborhoods. And so one of the main kind of crossover patterns that you see in these communities is Italian Catholic women also being invited in to Mahjong groups. But when they were invited into a predominantly Jewish space. So it's part of a proliferation of cultural rather than theological markers of this, of a national Jewish culture evolving in this era. So this image of a suburban house here was lived in by Rita Greenstein, who's someone I interviewed. She moved from a Bronx cooperative housing project that she had grown up with extremely painful interactions with anti-Semitic interactions with her Catholic neighbors in the 1920s and 30s. And she moved when she was raising her young children to Long Island, to that development that I just showed, and had Italian Catholic neighbors with a completely different context, but also increasingly turned to her neighborhood conservative synagogue to recreate that sense of Jewish community that she had in a very different context before. And she also turned to Mahjong, in part to create a sense of shared Jewish experience, but also simply to put together a community in what could be a very isolating suburban experience. This is really nationally consistent. This is a group in Valdosta, Georgia, just north of Florida. And this is a group in a Brooklyn dinette. And here, Hilda Schaeffer, that person whose photograph I showed at the very beginning, she took this picture of her dinette. And in it, you can see some of those really consistent cultural aspects. So you can see the card, the league's card in front of the rack. Racks are also specific to American Mahjong play. They started in the 1920s, but almost no other Mahjong type around the world uses racks. It's an American thing. You can see the cigarette in her hand, and behind her, as one of them is tapping out her cigarette, you can also see the shell of a pineapple. And one of the things that I've heard over and over again are these shared kind of food and social rhythms associated with it. It was a time when women could, quote, let their hair down. And so sometimes there was drinking associated with it, and more smoking than usual. And one of the things that I also heard from people who grew up as children in these homes was that they were often invited to prepare the snacks like those pineapple slices with maraschino cherries speared on top before they were shooed away, before the ladies came or the game began. And so even though players came to this game as a game, and they came to it to meet people or to reinforce those communities, it becomes a way of marking Jewish space without making that explicit in the context of the pressures of assimilation into these predominantly white, middle-class suburban neighborhoods. They were also a lifeline for young mothers, especially dealing with the pressures and the contradictions that young mothers in the 1950s faced. Today, this is a recent representation by a young man who creates images of the Jewish experience that he says, quote, ties us all together. And it's notable that Mahjong was one of them. Even the rhythm of the game, I think, helped facilitate some of these social patterns, because shuffling the tiles between rounds of play takes longer than shuffling a deck of cards. So I've interviewed people who played Mahjong along with other games, and they said that the relationships they formed at the Mahjong table were particularly strong and lasted often decades. Today, Mahjong is experiencing a resurgence in American culture along different lines, and part of that is, whenever you have representations in the media, like there was in Crazy Rich Asians, that sparks interest in different forms of Mahjong. Is connected also to immigration reform and the diversification of Asian immigration in the late 20th century. And today, as more baby boomers are retiring, they're often turning to Mahjong and as a way to form community in often new neighborhoods or new living environments. And it's the League's version is today spreading far beyond Jewish women's networks, as well as remaining very tied to and connected to a modern Jewish culture. So Mahjong's American history is rooted in the tension between inclusion and exclusion, as well as the risks of cultural erasure through appropriation or assimilation. I think Mahjong reveals a deeply American experience, sometimes desired and sometimes enforced, of simultaneously belonging and standing apart. This is my contact information. You are welcome to get in touch with me and share your memories. I always love hearing from people, and I'm happy to take questions now. So thank you so much. Oh, sorry, Carrie, you're muted.
Sorry about that. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to submit them via the chat feature, and we'll just wait a few seconds. I have the chat open, so we'll see if anyone has anything to ask of you.
And again, I always love hearing memories, so feel free to just put in if there's anything that resonated with you or is very different from your experience. I also love hearing when someone is coming from a different perspective.
We'll just wait. Oh, here we have one. Laurie Champagne had said, are there consistent rules now, or do they keep changing?
Yes. So the league's version of the game, what is today most often referred to as American Mahjong, but as I already talked about, there are multiple American forms of Mahjong. So I usually either call it the league's game or what they call it, which is National Mahjong. So the league's version really stabilizes in the early 1960s. It had that period of more than a decade of really impressive frequent experimentation. But since the early 1960s, it has not changed. Again, the annual rule card, of course, does. But like I mentioned early in the talk, there are more than 40 variations of the game around the world today. And there are, in each of those cultural traditions, it's a living thing, right? Things continue to evolve and to change. And so there are changes that happen over time, big picture.
We have a question from Sue Kaliski. Are young people playing the game? Do you think it will be around in 50 years?
Oh, yes. I certainly hope and I trust that it will be around in 50 years. It certainly deserves to be, but I truly believe that it will. Young people are playing the game today. Partially what happens is the golden era of the league's game ends with the changes in cultural context, but also simply the rhythms of daily life and the pressures of daily life that changed by the early 1960s. So that for both cultural reasons and financial pressures, more parents are working full time. Both parents. Parenting philosophies have also changed, so there tend to be far more hands-on, far more intensive parenting theories, and so basically the kind of core group that started Mahjong culture is less likely to have either the availability or some of those same cultural patterns to draw from. And they're less likely to feel some of those pressures of isolation that young mothers did at the time as well. So there are multiple reasons why this changes, but it is still true that young people are learning the game, often coming to it for heritage reasons. So Asian Americans are learning the game, Jewish Americans are learning the game, young Jewish men are learning the game. But I think that as people continue to retire also, and as it becomes an increasingly important part of a retirement communities, I think that will also have its own generational transition that will remain into the future.
E. Bettman wanted to know, is Rummy Cube mostly from Mahjong?
Interestingly, Rummy Cube was created in Israel that combines elements of Mahjong with elements of Rummy and card games. So it is influenced by Mahjong, but that's not the only influence. Mm-hmm. And it's in the 20th century. It's quite a recent game.
Leora D asked, what are the most striking differences between American Mahjong and Chinese Mahjong today?
There are multiple core differences. One is that the end goal of the game itself is different. So in Chinese Mahjong, you can, like Gin Rummy, right? There are lots of different possible combinations, but you have to follow specific patterns. And the strategy for that style of game, so in other words, it's very simple to kind of initially learn, but the strategy really takes a lifetime to master because it's all connected to a complex system of scoring. And so how you make a winning hand is really essential to whether or not you win. And so if you're pulling the tile from somebody else or drawing from the center, what order you're completing in, all of those shape a final score. And in American Mahjong, or the national version of the game, it is about making those completing an annual card, one of those winning hands, and the scoring is very simple, right? The card tells you what the scoring is. The strategy then lies at different times in the game. And so with the leagues game, what experienced players will say is the game is won and lost in the Charleston, in that initial rounds of shuffling, because that's when you decide what you're going for, and you also get a sense of what other people might be going for. In Chinese Mahjong, there is no Charleston. That doesn't exist, right? So there's fundamentally different kind of strategic orientations to the game, but both are very challenging. Both can be played very competitively or very socially. Mahjong as a game is quite unusual in being able to traverse this whole spectrum of really intense competitive play or very relaxed social play. And in China, it can be played for very high stakes as a gambling game, or for very, very low stakes, like just for pennies. And that's always been true. And that is quite unusual for a game to kind of have that whole spectrum.
The question came in, so how do you play the Chinese version?
Well, what I'll actually do is refer you to some excellent resources that exist to learn the Chinese version. But what I'll say is, again, the very basic version of the game is very simple and easier to learn initially than the American version. It's the strategy as connected to the scoring that's really complicated. And so there are quite a number of videos on YouTube that I think are effective. There are also community organizations as Mahjong is gaining in this popularity, you're more and more likely to live in a place that offers Mahjong classes in different traditions. So, basically, there are better ways to actually learn than me trying to explain the basics of the game right now. But I think that one of the exciting things and what the question reveals is that as people learn more about the game and its diverse history, I hear more and more people interested in learning styles that are different from the kinds that they're most familiar with. So as part of the growing popularity today, I also see increasing kind of crossover between traditions that really did not happen before. So I think that's exciting.
We'll just wait another second. If there's any additional questions, please submit them via the chat feature, and we'll wait and see if anyone else has anything they'd like to add, any comments, any reminiscences. We'll just wait another second for that to see if any come through.
Something I always like to hear, if people feel like writing it in the chat, is what was your earliest Mahjong memory? And Kara, I don't know if you feel like sharing your earliest Mahjong memory.
Mine was, I remember my grandmother used to play with her friends that she had grown up with. And they would play every week at a Jewish or different person's house. And so I used to always know when it was Maj week, because she would have all of her Maj set out, and she would always make really special treats like mandel bread and things like that. So we'd always get, when she hosted, all these great treats from her hosting. So that was something that I remember. And we have a couple memories. Susan Moisey said falling asleep to the clicking tiles. Mm-hmm. And Dina Scher said earliest memory was crack, crack, boom.
It's one of the striking and really wonderful things that I hear over and over again from people who grew up with it. Just as you described, Kara, these rhythms and the kind of excitement and joy also for a lot of times for the kids of like, ooh, there is going to be some, even if we're not allowed to eat them beforehand, there's probably going to be some tasty leftovers afterward. And I remember, I've read people talk about what it meant to them to see their mothers also kind of as whole people, as connected to people who were not their family. It's like, oh, look at the way she's laughing, and I can hear those tiles. I can hear those comforting sounds of them laughing and chatting, and the sound of the tiles as I fall asleep.
Yep. And Risha Ring said she remembers sneaking in when the women were getting coffee and running in to get bridge mix, and then hearing Bam 3 crack and Maj, and the same women playing together for 35 years, which I know is something I think a lot of people, they form their groups and it really becomes a very core social circle for them.
One of the women I interviewed said this wasn't just a game, it was like life itself, and I think that really speaks to the way that it was so integrated into people's sense of self and communities in really remarkable ways. And one of the things that I hear now that's also very powerful is how the next generation often rejected Mahjong. It was connected to this very Cold War era sense of what it meant to be a Jewish woman or a wife and mother. And the next generation often pushed against that. And at the same time, it really became connected to a negative stereotype of Jewish women that people like Philip Roth helped popularize in books like The Portnoy's Complaint, where this aspect that I've talked about very positively of like carving out time and space for female communities in their homes, then in as part of a negative stereotype becomes a sense of this is an illegitimate or aggressive taking up of space. And so for various reasons, the next generation often rejected it. And now that generation is also now retiring and their mothers have passed away. And their relationship to their memories of their mothers has also changed. And I've heard so many people say, when I play with my mother's set or when I'm playing with my grandmother's set, it's like I'm playing with her. And I think that is incredibly powerful and speaks to, again, part of what makes Mahjong a game of the senses, but also part of how that material aspect becomes woven in to those cultural aspects as well.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for coming here and speaking with us tonight. We really, really appreciate it. And I will be sure to make sure that everybody has your contact information in case they have any more questions. Oh, we just had one more comment come through. And it said, I took a couple of my grandmother's miscellaneous tiles when she passed and made them into fridge magnets.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, way of keeping her close.
Yes, but thank you so much again for speaking to us about a topic that's really near and dear to a lot of the people on here. I think many of us have played, are in groups currently, so it's really wonderful to hear the history of a game that is so socially and culturally important. We hope that those of you who tuned in tonight will join us again for one of our upcoming programs, and we thank you all for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.